their mics are going to be muted, right?
All right, we'll start in just a second. I see that folks are starting to log in. I'll give it a minute, but welcome. John, did you have a question while folks are still logging in? A tech question?
So their mics are going to be muted. Is that the format here? There's a lot of different ways, lots of different dials that can be turned on or off.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
It's whatever the buttons I pushed. I'm not sure what we're gonna do. No, I'm kidding. I just push all the buttons and see what happens.
Well, that's fine.
Surprise.
Yeah. I do a lot of stuff like this, and I spent a lot of time teaching online during COVID, so I'm pretty used to Zoom. It's not the best, but I'm reasonably used to it. Hopefully, no terrible no terrible technical issues or anything like that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and folks can trickle in as they do. Hi, everyone. Christine Dursey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA. Welcome to our session. This session is actually hosted by our Miami Valley section of APA, and I'll turn it over to Susan in a moment just to kind of kick things off. For those of you that are members or aren't members, we have 5 sections here in Ohio. And you can learn about us, about our organization, about our sections, and what Miami Valley particularly is up to by visiting our website, ohioplanning.org. We are recording this session, and we will post it up onto our YouTube channel so that you can share this with friends and colleagues, or even just watch it again. And I'll post the link to our YouTube channel in the chat here in just a moment. If you have questions for our panelists today, you can type those in the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end. We have a designated Q&A section. Please don't raise your hand or anything like that because we don't have any sound associated with you as the attendees. So just type those questions in the Q&A box. And if you're having technical issues, you can type questions in there too. I'll be able to field those hopefully. This session has been approved for 1 CM credit, and I am applying this for on-demand credit. So for friends and colleagues, they'll be able to view this after the fact as well and get their 1 AICP CM credit. So that's the end of my housekeeping items. I'm going to turn it over to you, Susan, to kick things off and introduce today's session.
Thank you, Christine. I am Susan Vincent. I'm a planner with the City of Dayton, and I'm so excited to welcome everyone to the APA Miami Valley Section's first professional development event for 2024. I'm also the section's inaugural professional development chair, so I'm looking forward to sending out future invitations for additional professional development and social events, which we hope will help you grow your professional network and or reconnect with your professional network and grow your professional practice. So we're excited to share this presentation with you today from one of our own who has relocated about adapting land evaluation and site assessment tools, which are traditionally used in rural areas in support of urban and suburban agriculture. Dr. Jones is going to share how planners can leverage the uLESA model to guide policy and programmatic innovation in the pursuit of more sustainable regional food systems for our communities, which I think we can all get behind. So just some brief introductions for our 2 speakers. Dr. Jones is an assistant professor in the Center for Environmental Studies and a funded faculty member of the Institute of Inclusion, Inquiry and Innovation, or ICUBED, at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. His research focuses on the intersection of urban food system development, urban food insecurity, local governments, and the challenges facing America's post-industrial cities and a globalizing world. He holds a PhD in urban studies or urban systems from Rutgers University and the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and also has an MPA and a BA in political science from the University of Dayton. So also joining us today is Andrew Cameron. He is based in Newport News, Virginia. He is on track to graduate with a master's in environmental studies from Virginia Commonwealth University next month. So congratulations early, Andrew. His studies have concentrated on applying geographic information systems, or GIS, and data analysis to explore environmental questions. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Jones, and thanks for your time and information today.
Thanks, Susan. I really appreciate that. And that's a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. The challenge of I have to spend most of the next, I don't know, maybe like 50 minutes or so, kind of like talking at a computer screen is a little challenging. So I guess I would invite all of you, if you do have questions, please try to put them in the Q&A. I got two screens, so I can try to adjust a little bit. So we do try to have some sort of dynamic conversation here, because I really hate, I don't know, I've been doing Zoom stuff for a long time now, and just kind of like talking at the monitor for long periods of time is not necessarily the best. But as Susan indicated, so I actually am a Dayton native, and I'm really excited that I get the opportunity to come back and talk to some Ohioans again. A little bit of the story of kind of how I ended up doing this. So in the late 2000s, I was working for the Ohio Treasurer of the Ohio Treasurer of State's office, and I had 11 counties in Western Ohio. So basically, like Dayton to Wapakoneta, and then Springfield west to the Indiana border, that I would travel around and talk about economic development programs. And I ran into a lot of mayors, economic development directors, chamber of commerce presidents, et cetera, that kept talking about the challenges of what do we do with all these vacant spaces in a lot of our post-industrial communities. And I know we've struggled. At least I know it's been a little while since I've lived in Ohio, but I know post-industrial cities continue to try to struggle with, like, what do we do with these vacant spaces? And so right around that same time, I ran into folks from Ohio State Extension that were working in community gardening programming in Dayton. And I became really interested in the idea of agriculture to start with, and then kind of food systems more in general, coming back into some of these urban spaces and re-engaging or reutilizing some of those spaces. Definitely not all of them, but at least some of those spaces, and trying to put them back into some sort of use. And so as a result of strange politics and economic issues in the late aughts, early 2010s, I eventually decided that I wanted to go get a PhD. And so I went off to New Jersey, and then eventually came down to Virginia after that. But half of my doctoral dissertation looked at Dayton's urban food system. And so if anybody's interested in kind of looking at my research in the Dayton area food system, I can definitely, Susan, maybe I'll talk with Susan and Christine after this, so we can try to get to the link to my dissertation if anybody wants to look at some research from that. I realize it's like a whole book, so you might not want to read the whole thing, but maybe there might be some interesting insights there. But what I'm here talking about today is how we can more intentionally, as planners, how we can more intentionally work towards crafting healthier, more sustainable food systems. And I'm going to move on to my slides now, assuming I'm clicking the right button. There we go. So some of you may know this, some of you may not. So apologies if I'm covering ground that you may already know. But the idea that planners should care about the food system is an old idea, and then also kind of fell out of favor for a long time, and now it's kind of coming back. But some of you may have heard of Ebenezer Howard in the late Victorian era. He had this idea of what we call the Garden City. I'm assuming many of you probably heard this, at least in some capacity. But this was a response to the conditions of the Victorian city, and the crowding and the congestion of the Victorian city, and the kind of the effects of how the Industrial Revolution was changing the nature of our urban environments. And so he proposed, and I have another image on the next slide as well, but this idea that and the idea that we should be intentionally crafting and planning for food systems within our communities. And this, he was planning during the era of railroads, so he loved the railroads, kind of pushing the congested urban spaces out into the rural, undeveloped areas of England, and intentionally trying to plan for gardening and agricultural spaces and the transportation infrastructure necessary to kind of move that food around as part of this idealized way of viewing what the city is and is not. And I just realized that there's someone in the chat said something, but I'm paying attention to the Q&A. But I don't have too many windows open at the same time. But Howard's ideas were largely not accepted, both in the United Kingdom and then also in the United States. And for a number of different reasons, food system planning has been largely absent throughout most of the 20th century in the United States. A lot of that has to do with, and I'm sure you all have heard this term before in some capacity or another, but the urban-rural divide. There are a number of sociologists out of the School of Chicago, the urban schools, the the Chicago School of Urban Sociology in the early part of the 20th century that did a lot of normative writing about what urban is and is not, and what rural is and is not. And their writings were really influential in the early development of the planning profession to say there should be this binary black and white of like, these things should be urban and these things should be rural, and they shouldn't really mix. And so the idea that food systems is a rural activity and it's not something that we as planners should necessarily care about, that's kind of where that comes from. Simultaneously, while this is going on, also the industrialization of the food system is kind of kicking into high gear in the 20th century. And the idea that we could be planning at the local and regional level kind of falls away as multimodal transportation networks allow the development of the industrialized food system as we know it today, which is that thing that allows the grocery stores to be completely stocked with products all the time. And we don't really think about too much about where all that food comes from and kind of how all that arrives in the grocery stores. It just kind of magically does. And I like to talk a lot about this particular point because under American capitalism, the food system and the corporate interest within that food system like to make the food invisible, like the mechanics of how that food shows up in the grocery store. They try to make that as invisible as possible. When you all, if you're working in the office today, when you're done listening to this presentation, you may go to lunch. You may go out to lunch to a restaurant. You may not be thinking too much about where that food that restaurant is going to prepare for you. You're not really thinking probably too much about like how do all those ingredients potentially from different continents arrive at that individual restaurant so that those people can prepare that food for you. You're probably not really thinking about that. You may now that I'm telling you to think about it, but often you may not. And so that, because we're not really intentionally thinking about how we plan for food in our cities, that has led to some of the problems that we deal with today. I don't want to lay all of that on the feet of planners because that's not the case. But I'm kind of arguing for a greater intentionality within how planning approaches food systems. And I'm not the only person that's suggesting this, certainly. This is another slide. I kind of thought about cutting this one, but this is just kind of underscoring what the food system is. So it is a complete process from the production to the distribution, to the marketing, to the purchasing, to the preparation, and then to the waste. So all of that, when we're thinking about the food system, is how you should be conceptualizing this. So the entirety, that production all the way to waste management. But a lot of this is invisible, as I said. Like there's this idea that from big food and big agricultural interests, they want to make this invisible. They don't want us to think about where the food comes from. It just kind of shows up. And that is wonderful in some ways. That is astounding in some ways. But there's also a lot of negative externalities to that. And there's a lot of people that lose out in that system. And arguing towards greater intentionality from us as planners, I think is something that I think it's reasonably low-hanging fruit in a lot of ways. And we could do a lot to try to improve the material conditions of many of the people that live in our communities. So that urban-rural divide is present and kind of says food is a rural activity and we shouldn't really be engaging in it. But yet also there's this, and I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of this because this is a complex slide, but there's a long history of urban agriculture in the United States simultaneously at the same time. That upper image is this guy named Hazen Pingree, who was the mayor of Detroit in the 1890s. He had this idea, he sold his prized racehorse to buy seeds and plows for Polish immigrants in Detroit to set up community gardens during a recession in the 1890s. He inspired this movement in many cities across the country, including Cleveland and Dayton, at least that I'm aware of, started similar movements based on what kind of came out of Detroit. The image in the top right is the war garden movement during World War I. The bottom left image is and I never remember, I always think ERA and I think of something else, Emergency Relief Act during the Great Depression. There was some programming from the federal government towards urban gardening during that time period. The middle bottom image is a victory garden during World War II. And then in the bottom right image there, this is from the 1970s in New York City as the beginning of what we now kind of call the community gardening movement as a response to post-industrial pressures and deindustrialization in the 60s and the beginning in the 1960s and the 1970s. So there's always been urban agriculture in the United States. It's just often invisible in some ways, or it's not necessarily really actively talked about. It's kind of a response to economic problems, but it's not really a planned, intentional activity. And so, and we got to bring this up into the present day, there are recent trends within food system planning. You probably heard the term food deserts or maybe food swamps within an urban context. There's often community assessments that go in to try to map where these are and where these aren't. I'm a little suspicious of how we conceptualize these problems and then how we map it. But I still think it's good that we're at least talking about it for the first time. And there's also an emphasis on trying to include urban agriculture, at least in some capacity, in mixed use development. I've seen some examples of this, and I think that's really encouraging. But there's this presumption that this is often a transitive use of space, especially in a post-industrial context. Like, well, that's the vacant lot. We'll give these gardeners access to this space for a little while until higher and better development comes in, and we can put an apartment building there. And I don't want to knock the city of Dayton. I know there's at least one city of Dayton person here. Hi. Well, I'm Susan. I know Susan's here, and then hi, Ann. I don't have a lot of time to talk about Garden Station, but Garden Station was a city-owned property that the city leased. I believe there was a lease structure in place to some local gardeners, but that was a transitive use, that there was always kind of a thought, at least from what I understand, that there was going to be development that was going to come in there. And eventually the city said, hey, we need to take that space back because we're gonna try to get an apartment building there. And that caused a lot of conflict between the gardeners and the city over that. And that didn't really work out really well for a lot of people involved, unfortunately. But like ultimately that space probably should be apartments. Or some sort of housing or commercial activity. It probably shouldn't be a garden given the density and the likelihood of development in that particular area. So I would kind of say that that's probably an example of where that probably should never have been a garden space to start with, because there was this thought that, yeah, there probably was going to be development there. So giving that to gardeners for like a year or two, then you have to deal with the political problem of, okay, now we're going to kick you out. And that's what I'm trying to actively avoid here with what the mapping that we're going to be talking about here a little bit later. One other thing I want to mention as far as urban agriculture goes is that there's significant changes in technology just in the last generation, if maybe 15 years, where now agricultural production is possible in spaces that didn't exist before, on the tops of rooftops, which is the top right image is from Brooklyn Grange. That's about an acre urban farm on the top of a building in the Brooklyn Navy Yard area. And the image on the bottom right, that's a it's an aeroponic lettuce farm, I would say lettuce factory in Newark, New Jersey. And so these changes in technology are allowing food to be produced in different spaces than we kind of traditionally think about where food can be produced. And that's very exciting. And I think that it's our job as planners to try to figure out like where should these spaces be from a predictive space, like where should we be targeting these sorts of activities? So that's a great question. How we conceptualize and how we kind of like count what those kitchen gardens are or other types of gardens are, everybody kind of has slightly different definitions. And so it's really kind of hard to count exactly what is and what isn't. And I have not seen anything, at least the research that I've looked at, I haven't seen any sort of what I would call solid definitive measurement of how many there are. And also given the often like guerrilla nature of how some non-commercialized gardens can organize, they don't necessarily want to be counted. And so it's hard to give an exact number, unfortunately. I wish that I had a better answer for you on that, and I'm sorry that I don't. But so I'm going to be advocating here today a tool that Andrew and I and a former grad student and I, we've developed that we can use GIS to try to say predictively, to a certain point predictively, if you're going to encourage urban agriculture within your community, where should you do it? Like, so basically, let's improve site suitability analysis for urban ag. And all this comes back to this idea of the urban food commons. I wasn't the person that created this idea, but if we think about the challenge of climate change and how that is going to be eroding agricultural production globally over the next, say, 100 years, how many hectares of rice production have been disrupted in India this year? we should, as planners, be thinking about how we can create resiliency within our communities so that 100 years from now, there are still some spaces in the urban fabric that can be used to produce food in some capacity. Now, I'm not saying that Cleveland or Columbus or Toledo adding a couple acres of community gardens is going to replace the productive capacity of 100 or 10,000 hectares of rice production in India. I'm not saying that that's not an apples to apples comparison by any stretch of the imagination. But if cities across the country start to build in this resiliency into their land use management, that's going to help give a little bit more cushion to that problem as the global food system starts to continue to absorb these erosions of where we can and can't produce food. So a big aspect of urban agriculture is that we need stable land tenure, or the idea that the gardeners and farmers have confidence that year to year, they're going to be able to control that space, because they can't produce infrastructural improvements to that space if they don't have any confidence that they're going to control it year to year. I'm not necessarily saying that they should own the land. There could be models where you would do that, but there may not be. You could use long-term easements as a way of protecting sites, and that's actually a thing that I'm advocating for. To try to protect these sites, because ultimately, if really we're talking about in my analysis, we're talking about where are the best spaces to try to do this thing. And if these really are the best spaces in the community empirically, we need to try to protect those in the long term, because 100 years from now, it's very likely those spaces are still probably going to be the best spaces. And if we can protect those sites from a generational, or at least a decades-long perspective, that'll give confidence to the gardeners and farmers working those sites to allow them to develop infrastructure and to develop the soil quality on those sites so that they really are robust and can be as productive as they possibly can, both economically and then also in the other kind of side benefits that urban agriculture has for its communities. So the rhetorical question that I'm asking with this analysis is, what sort of empirical tools could we use to try to improve site selection? And then how can those tools improve land tenure stability as it relates to long-term land use policy? At the same time, though, there are lots of negative externalities in our communities that we can also probably try to mitigate through this process. And so in our analysis, we included some social equity and some climate change mitigation variables at the same time, because we want to try to counteract systemic deinvestment in BIPOC neighborhoods and to try to increase green spaces. And then also, as heat island mapping becomes more commonplace in urban areas, if we're talking about adding green spaces, we should be trying to add green spaces into areas that are suffering from heat island effects. The Science Museum of Virginia, which is based here in Richmond, mapped the urban heat island environment for the city of Richmond. And so we're drawing that analysis into our analysis to try to say, well, we can try to help mitigate the problems of these urban heat islands. So I don't know how much that's happening in the state of Ohio. I hope it is. And so that's one more thing we want to try to include within our analysis. So as we talk about as we're talking about what type of urban agriculture specifically we're looking at in this analysis, there's a lot of different types of urban agriculture. I don't have time to get into all of them, but hydroponics would be very different from what we were talking about. We were talking about a preference for in-ground vegetable production. So think so we're not talking about corn or soybean, anything like that. We're talking about lettuces, greens, tomatoes, things of that nature. And that's often going to be produced in a diverse capacity. You're not generally just going to be producing one of those types of crops. You're going to be producing a bunch of different crops kind of all together, often complementing each other, as planting alliums next to nightshades. You get some pesticide, some pest protection as you combine those two plants together. Now, the gardeners in the room are probably going to know something like that. But also, at least as far as the city of Richmond was concerned, and that's the mapping that we're talking about here, they were open to us including permeable surfaces, so because they were open to the idea of potentially depaving some of the parts of their communities. And so we included that within the analysis because they were open to the idea of potentially depaving. So what is the uLESA model? So this is urban land evaluation and site assessment, or uLESA. There's a geospatial model that I've adapted using an existing USDA model called LESA, or regular LESA, which is used in rural land management to try to identify where you should be putting like a corn, like where should corn production be going or where soybean production should be going. We're taking that same kind of basic structure of analysis, but we're trying to pivot it towards an urban and to a lesser extent suburban context, so that we could be focusing not on like corn production, but like where should you put tomato production or your leafy green production. But at the same time, we're trying to retain rather, the empirical structure of that analysis and also the localizability of the analysis and stakeholder input in that process. Because every map that we're creating, we've mapped 2 communities now, and we're hoping to map other communities, possibly your community, in the near future. And every map that we're producing is localized to your government, based on input both from government folks and then also from farmers within the region and possibly other actors. So I'll get to your comment in a minute or two, Krishna. But so as of right now, previously we've mapped Chesterfield County, which is the county government directly south of the city of Richmond. Here in Virginia, local government works differently. So cities and counties are mutually exclusive entities. And so kind of Richmond is on the same kind of like governmental power structure as county governments are. So previously we mapped Chesterfield County. Now we're in the process of mapping Richmond City, which you can see on the map there. And then next we're going to start mapping Henrico County. And then after that, we're open to the idea of trying to map other communities, possibly your community in the state of Ohio, if you're interested. And so the model has improved dramatically. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but the model that we mapped Chesterfield County for, that's kind of like version 1 of our analysis model. Version 2, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is the city of Richmond. It's a dramatically better version. We're learning as we go with this because no one's done this before. So I'm not exactly making it up as I go along, but it is definitely an evolving process as we do this, where I'm learning about how to do this in a better way. So I'll move on from there. But how the process works is that we're going to work, we work with the community, so in this case, the city of Richmond, to identify variables or analysis factors, criteria factor, and then potentially available sources of data within the community. So we're not doing any primary data collection. We're just looking at existing data sources and trying to identify analysis criteria from existing data sources. Then in a collaborative process with local government folks and or farmers and or other potential stakeholders, we're trying to figure out how important or how much weight we should assign each criteria or variable within the analysis. Then we're running the analysis. Then we're integrating that with the parcel layer, and Andrew will talk about that in a little bit. I guess we didn't mention up here, we're also uploading that into a web app for the first time, and Andrew has really been instrumental in bringing the web app online, because I don't have any experience with doing that yet. And so it's really, really exciting what Andrew's done as far as changing the game about bringing it to ARC Online. I think it's great. One step that we haven't done yet is moving towards creating a system of conducting individual site assessments. As you'll see, this is a great way of identifying potential parcels and potential sites, but this is all bird's eye view analysis. And so as students of Jane Jacobs, we should all be aware that we need to have street level analysis and street level perspectives as well as bird's eye view analysis. So we haven't figured out exactly how to do that street level analysis yet. That's something I'm kind of moving towards, but we don't really have anything to report on that beyond, I know I want to do that. I just haven't gotten there yet. So Andrew, do you want to take this slide? I'm losing my pace here. Did you?
Yeah. I think I'll
cool.
take it from
Yep.
for the next few. Thanks, John.
Yep.
So as John alluded to a couple of slides ago, this Richmond model, in fact, comprises 2 submodels, an agricultural model and an equity submodel. And each submodel in turn is the product of a number of variables or factors that were selected and assigned weights in this sort of collaborative process. And you can see here on this slide just what exactly those factors were that went into each of the submodels. And in the interest of time, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time sort of going over every single variable in detail, but just to sort of give you a sense of the role that they're playing. The environmental resources variable is to sort of ensure that areas that are identified avoid important environmental resources, right? Like resource protection areas, wetlands, ecological cores. And you'll notice that has an asterisk next to it, and several of these variables have those asterisks. And what that is indicating is that unlike variables that don't have an asterisk, these variables or factors have what we call sort of a failout condition. And so if some particular criteria is not met, that area is excluded from the analysis. So in this case, if a particular area is, within a particular 100 feet, I believe it was, of a wetland, then it's excluded from the analysis. If it falls within a resource protection area, we don't consider it as a potential site for urban agriculture. Watershed impact, right, is to avoid obviously areas that are essential to maintaining and improving water quality. Land use, we're trying to exclude land cover types that are not especially conducive to successful agriculture. Soil suitability is pretty straightforward. Slope, they're talking about the slope of the terrain. Trying to prioritize areas that are flat, relatively flat. And that has, as you can see, a fail-out condition indicating that in this case, I believe the threshold was 10%. So if there's a slope greater than 10%, we didn't consider that area in the analysis, no matter how it's scored on these other variables. Aspect here refers to the cardinal direction, the orientation, sort of the direction in which that particular area is facing. So trying to ensure areas that are receiving like the optimal amount of sunlight to kind of maximize agricultural yields. Avoiding contaminated areas is pretty straightforward. Avoiding areas that are with potentially contaminated soils, Superfund sites. Also avoiding cemeteries was important here. And then sea level rise and flooding, that was based on Richmond's own 2030 sea level rise flood scenario. So any area that fell within that area that's identified by the flood scenario was simply excluded from the analysis. And then on the equity side, we had 4 variables that were considered. So low food access, so is an area, a food desert, basically, prioritizing areas where people don't have so much access to to good, healthy, fresh food. Equity of investment, concern with prioritizing access again to sort of fresh food and agricultural green spaces in areas that are traditionally underserved. Social vulnerability, prioritizing areas, prioritizing access to fresh food and agricultural green spaces, again, in sort of traditionally underserved communities. And then the last one, heat island mitigation, where John talked about this a bit, looked at the data from the Science Museum of Virginia and tried to prioritize the areas that are most impacted by the heat island effect to kind of prioritize creating protected agricultural areas that might, also function as green infrastructure to try to dissipate, hopefully, some of that urban heat. So if I go to the next slide, John. Thank you. So central to this modeling is the idea of raster analysis and raster data. So just in case anybody's not familiar with the concept of a raster or raster data, you can think of like a digital photo. If you look at a photo on your computer and zoom in close enough, you can see it's really like a mosaic of pixels or cells. And each one of those cells stores data. So on a computer image, right, the data that's stored is what specific color should kind of be filling in this particular cell. But raster data has applications certainly beyond just digital photography. And in the context of GIS, it can be extremely valuable for representing data that can kind of be distributed across a surface, the distribution of values across a surface. So if you can imagine a surface, some portion of the surface of the Earth, in this case, we're looking at the city of Richmond, you can imagine that we kind of laid a grid over the city of Richmond. And in the case of this model, that grid was composed of cells that were 30 by 30 meters. And raster data basically allows us to determine within each one of those cells, what is the specific value of a given variable of interest. So if we take, say, the slope layer, our slope raster data, we can see within each 30 by 30 meter cell, what is the slope there? Or what is the social vulnerability index score? Or what is the soil suitability score, et cetera. And so every cell ends up with a unique value associated with a particular variable. And then from there, to be able to kind of calculate a score, every one of those raster layers, so in the case of the ag model, we have 8 raster layers. In the case of the equity model, there are 4 raster layers. Each one of those raster layers corresponds to a variable, and each one of those raster layers basically has the values in those raster cells replaced by a score. So the scores were determined, based on certain criteria, depending on the particular factor that we were looking at. In the case of whether an area was within a resource protection area or near a wetland. It was basically binary. It was either it's in that area, or it's too close, or it's not. So it either got a full score of 10 points or it got 0 points. But for each variable, those attributes were sort of reclassified, rescored to this 10-point scoring system. And that sort of standardized the scoring and allowed us in each case to ultimately, overlay these raster layers on top of one another and calculate sort of a cumulative score for any one cell. And so we ended up with an agricultural model that had a maximum score of 100 and an equity model that had a maximum score of 100. And to generate our final model, we overlaid both of those sort of composite raster layers and divided by 2 to come up with the sort of combined final model score. So John, can I go to the next slide, please? And so here you can see these are the sort of final maps of each of the individual submodels. On the left is the agriculture and natural resource model. On the right, the equity model. And you just sort of get a sense of how things broke down in the city of Richmond. You'll notice perhaps that the equity model, aside from the color scheme being different, sort of the distribution of colors doesn't quite look as pixelated. You have sort of these larger swaths of more homogeneous scoring. And that has to do with the fact that pretty much all of the data layers that we use for the ag model were in fact rasters, 30 by 30 meter raster data, whereas the equity model really is looking at socioeconomic data, demographic data, and that's not available. That's not collected in sort of 30 by 30 meter cells, right? That's collected at, say, the block group level. And so you have these larger geographies initially in which that data is available. And so what we did was rasterize or convert that data into a 30 by 30 meter grid to make it compatible with our analysis. But for that reason, it creates this sort of more, a bit more sort of homogeneous appearance of scoring throughout the study area. Next slide, John, please. And then this is what the final model looks like, the combined model after we've taken the agricultural model, taken the equity model, put them together, divided by 2. This is the final model that we have produced for the city of Richmond. You can see we've broken the sort of scoring classes into high, moderate, and low. That was based on basically the particular distribution of this data. So these scores are useful and valuable within the context of the study area, but they don't have some like corresponding referent outside of the study area that we can sort of look to compare them against. These scores really only make sense within the context of the study area and compared to one another. So we determine these classes sort of based around standard deviations. So a high score is any cell, any of these 30 by 30 meter cells that was greater than 1.5 standard deviations above the mean score. A moderate score was determined 1.5 standard deviations above or below the mean, and a low score was anything that was more than 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. And you can see there's plenty of area that doesn't have any color associated with it, right? And that's because a lot of cells ended up being excluded for one reason or another. The wrong land class type, it's too close to a wetland, it's a cemetery, it's got water, etc. But yeah, this is sort of the finished model here that you can see. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, John, but I'll send it back to you for the time being.
Nope, that was fantastic. And so this is a slightly dated version. That was wonderful, Andrew. Thank you. So this is a slightly dated version of the analysis here, because we're kick it back over to Andrew in a second to look at the web map that he created. But this is an example of kind of what the data looks like. This is a major park here within the city of Richmond. These numbers, we refined the analysis a little bit, but I think this is kind of a good example of like how potentially you could look at this. So the city of Richmond's Parks Department was interested in, hey, we potentially could put community gardens in this larger, this is called Bird Park here in Richmond. It's a 19th century park. We could potentially put community gardens here within this part of Bird Park. So let's like look at it at the, from the bird's eye perspective, potentially try to say, well, what areas could we group together? Because unfortunately and we kind of realized, Andrew and I were talking about this just the other day, the 30 meters by 30 meters, that actually may be too granular. If we're talking about like, what is the size of a sustainable garden space? We may actually want something larger than that. And so you're kind of looking at like blocks of high scoring cells together, not necessarily just a single one individually. But also this could inform this sort of view could potentially inform site visits as well. So you could say like maybe this top cluster here, the 87, 86, at kind of like the center top part of this, we could say, okay, we want to try to do a site assessment of that site. So then send out people to kind of do a on the ground evaluation of that particular space. One application of this, I mentioned that we talked about this in Chesterfield County as well. There was an earlier version of the mapping product. But so this is a proposed park within Chesterfield County. They were working with a development company to design a new park. And the developer was initially, or the architect firm was going to put a community garden underneath some power lines in a public utility right of way. And we pulled up our analysis. The image on the left, the hashed mark is where the proposed garden space was going to be. But we pulled up our analysis and we actually saw that a decent amount of that, the soil suitability was very poor for where they planned that initial garden space to be. But if they moved it just a few hundred feet east, it would be out of the occult, the geological occults that were going to create some drainage issues. And so based on this, Chesterfield County made the firm redesign that particular space within the overall master plan of the park. And so that's now going to be a community garden space based on our recommendations. So one aspect of how this can be utilized. Also, we've been working with Capital Region Land Conservancy, which is the regional land trust for Central Virginia. Land trust exists in Ohio, obviously, as well. They're very interested in our research because they could use this as targeting data to try to acquire agricultural easements on sites in the peri-urban region to try to protect it from development pressure. So this is a site that the Capital Region Land Conservancy was interested in Chesterfield County. They were having difficulty convincing the landowner to sell an easement on the property. But because of our data, this was actually the highest scoring privately owned site in Chesterfield County. And so because of our independent data, Capital Region Land Conservancy was able to convince the landowner to sell an easement for agricultural easement for that land. So that easement process is actually in process as we speak, which is very exciting that this map is kind of already doing something as far as land use goes within Chesterfield County. So those are kind of two practical examples of how the map can be used. So now I'm going to kick it over to Andrew to actually show the web map now.
Sure. Let me. What is it here? Okay. All right. So GIS technology has really advanced with kind of like remarkable speed over the last, I don't know, decade or so. I know John was sort of taken aback when I made him aware of the fact that certain like data layers in a web application can be dynamically updated without anybody having to manually change anything. For instance, if you link to the authoritative source from like a city's GeoHub or something. And so these are really like significant changes that have made it possible to create these really dynamic interfaces that can be used to communicate information to local officials, to, in the context of this work, to farmers or interested community members in general. These interactive maps can really support, I think, strategic project planning and decision-making. They can promote collaboration. The accessibility of web maps, I think, fosters kind of community-centric approach to urban agriculture. And the easy sharing and updating of maps that are referred to, I think, can really sort of increase the transparency and hopefully encourage public involvement. So this web application, you guys can see this, right? Everyone can see this? Somebody's confirm that for me?
Yep, I think we're good.
Okay, great. So this is, built out using one of Esri's sort of newest tools called Experience Builder. It's pretty powerful, I have to say. And I tried to construct this in a way that was user-friendly and not overly complicated. I've used plenty of like bad GIS tools online before, and I was trying to avoid that, but while still trying to maximize its utility. So I've closed out of it now. It opened initially with some text, that sort of guides the user through how this tool is intended to be used, how to read the map, what various functionality it has, and so forth. But what you're first greeted with here is a map that you probably recognized from a few slides ago. This is just the final combined uLESA model. There are other layers that are available in this map. So if somebody were interested, we have these two submodels that we can sort of tease apart from the primary model. If someone were interested in just looking at the ag suitability map, they could do that as well. Similarly, they could turn that off. And if they just wanted to see the equity suitability and how that shook out, that's available as well. For the purposes of this, I'll just keep on the combined model. If you were to click on any one particular cell, you get a pop-up here that informs you of specifically what the score is, what the combined model score is for that cell, along with the breakdown of what the submodel component scores were. And obviously you can zoom in and see more as well here. So I'll just go in for the purposes of demonstration to VCU. If I wanted to zoom in and look at VCU, it'll bring me in there and we can kind of get a sense of what's going on around VCU. At this resolution, it's not super helpful, but if I zoom in just a little bit more, we should get labels that indicate what exactly the score is for a given cell for a given area. And in addition to that, you may have noticed that the parcel layer turned on as well, which can be a really valuable sort of component to this, to trying to figure out when you're trying to cite urban ag using this tool. Potentially, it's great to know what sort of land use do the underlying parcels have, and you can see that here. And in addition to that, let's see, there's also, you may have noticed initially, there's, you can see where sort of current community gardens exist, which are these little green squares. I don't know how clearly they're visible on the shared screen here, but they're visible. We've also got a layer that indicates where there were model areas that scored relatively high, 75 we chose as a threshold here, that happen to intersect with city-owned parks. And the last item I'll kind of highlight here is that on the right side are these bookmarks that feature areas of the city that are kind of identified as sort of priority areas where we might want to focus urban agricultural initiatives in the future. And if you were to click on one, it will zoom you in to that particular neighborhood and sort of let you get a sense of how things look from the perspective of the model. But the hope is that this tool can be something valuable for public officials, for farmers, for potential farmers. That it will, at the moment, it's not publicly facing, it's just an internal application for the city, but hopefully that'll change at some point in the future. It'll be more accessible because I think that there is some real potential value to having these sort of tools more publicly available. And so, John, I'll let you take it back over, I guess. If I can stop this. Yeah, stopping sharing. There we go.
Perfect. Okay, and then I go to share, and then I click on that, I think. Hope I don't mess this up. All right, Andrew, do you see my screen again now?
Yep, you're good.
All right, cool. So I'm going to move quickly through the last bit of my slides because I do want to open this up to questions. So what this, in the short term, this is an application potentially for all of you listening here. Like we could come and map your government, your jurisdiction, so that you could have a similar map to what Richmond has, and you could use that to be making greater, increase the intentionality that you're engaging in as you're looking to try to talk with community gardeners and potential farmers around the region about creating these new spaces within your community. Land trusts also could benefit from this. As I mentioned, the Capital Region Land Conservancy, they're using this as targeting data to help them identify highly scoring sites to try to engage in agricultural preservation. But in a longer sense, I'm kind of advocating for a change in how we conceptualize urban agriculture, because traditionally it's kind of viewed as a transitive use, and like, okay, hey, we eventually want some development to come back into that space. We want to put an apartment building there at some point. Let's put a garden there at least for a little while until something better comes along. Like, there's still value in that, and I don't want to bemoan that. Like, there is some value in finding a way to use the space for a couple of years until development pressure comes in and says, okay, we're going to put an apartment building there or whatever. That we need that, but we also need this transformational use where we're intentionally saying, hey, we're trying to think about the city of 100 years from now and the food system of the city from 100 years from now. And these really are the best places, and we should be trying to protect those in a variety of different capacities in the long term, so that the people that live in our communities 100 years from now do have the ability to go engage in gardening and farming activities to try to help stabilize the food system of those future cities as we continue to deal with climate change. And so I think I'll probably just stop it there so that we can have time for questions. I had a couple other slides, but I think I'm going to stop it there. Susan, Chris, can we open it up? So I think you want people to be able to talk. Hopefully that's the case.
Oh, no, I think that right now the way it's set up is that people will just be able to type in.
Just be able to type questions?
I know
okay, cool.
I know I have questions, so if people do have questions, please feel free to type some into that chat, the Q&A box, like Chris described at the onset. But I think that this has just been really, I think, helpful framing for just a new way to think about urban agriculture, especially in our urban areas. Like the city of Dayton doesn't have an agricultural zoning district, right? So how are you seeing communities, or how would you recommend that communities go about doing some of this protection once you've done the analysis, right? Or does it make more sense in your mind to start with government-owned land, or to work on site control, or to really start doing some of that sort of zoning regulation updates?
One of the things that led me to this analysis is Susan, and for the other Dayton folks here. So Joe Tuss, I had a conversation with Joe Tuss, the former Montgomery County commissioner, God, I don't know, like 8 years ago or so. And he posed the question to me of, hey, all of the county owned water towers, all the green, just the grass that the county has to mow around all the water towers, could some of those be potentially turned into community gardens? Would that make sense or not? And so that question is not the only thing that led me to this analysis, but that was kind of one thing that really stood out in my brain when he posed that theoretical to me. And so, yeah, and that's why Andrew showed the layer of city-owned parks for Richmond that were above 75% suitable within the analysis. That's one thing that we're really, really interested in, because that the publicly owned land, or especially parkland, that's very, very low-hanging fruit. As far as it's already publicly owned, if you can just pivot it a little bit towards a specific purpose, if it's really high scoring, that's really low-hanging fruit, and you'll forgive the intentional food pun there. But as I think that the conversation around updating zoning, thank you for laughing at my food pun, the doing this sort of analysis, and then also thinking about how to conceptualize zoning differently as it relates to this, I think that those are parallel tracks. And we've been talking with the city of Richmond is going to be doing their zoning update in the very near future, and so I'm hoping that they come and talk with us about how we can be, how this analysis and how some of my other research can inform how they might be looking at changing their zoning code. We did some analysis, another former student and I, we did some sister city analysis of zoning codes of sister cities with the city of Richmond, which is not, I'm actually blanking if there are any Ohio cities identified as sister cities for Richmond. I think maybe Cleveland was. I can't remember now, but I think Cleveland might have been. But I can make that analysis open as well. I can kick it all to you afterwards, Susan. I can get that to you. But I think this is kind of concurrent with the idea of how can we include zoning revisions to allow for this sort of activity, because the permissibility in zoning is a big deal. Other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. I guess Susan or Chris, if you've got other questions,
Yeah,
I'm happy to
I've got more.
I'm happy to talk. So
yeah, so I think this one's for Andrew. In terms of the data that you used in order to build the model, I know that in just some of the work that we've done at the city, sometimes making sure you actually have the right data mapped to the right scale, and really so that they can talk to one another, can be a real challenge. So did you face any of those situations or issues with the data you're trying to utilize and model? I think particularly for the agricultural side of things. And if you can just talk a little bit about how you went about finding that data, and what that process was like.
Sure. So to come clean, I've joined John in this project in basically at the end of last year in January, effectively. And so at that point, the model had sort of already been built out for Richmond, and the data had been sourced and the acquisition was already done. So I was not myself personally involved in the process of acquiring this data. I'm looking forward to hopefully being part of that with the next go around when we get to Henrico. But I can speak to just generally kind of that being a challenge, and from some work I've done in the last couple of days, actually looking at the Richmond model, as you say, sort of making sure that your data is all at the same scale or resolution is definitely important so that it communicates effectively. So one of the challenges here is that the land cover data that's used in this particular model was at an extremely fine resolution. It was 1 meter land cover. So taken on its own, it's extremely informative. I mean, you can see at an incredibly granular scale what every sort of 1 meter by 1 meter cell on the surface of the earth is for that particular area. But to make that, as you say, speak to our, the data, I think one of the slides indicated, right, your model can only be as good as its coarsest data layer. And that was really sort of 30 by 30 was what that was. So all of that 1 meter land cover data had to be resampled up to 30 meters. And inevitably, in the process of doing that, you're going to lose some some detail, you're going to lose some information. And for that reason, you may see cells that are indicated in the model that haven't been excluded that nevertheless have maybe a significant amount of road in them or something. And that's why ground truthing is so important here, because in the process of resampling much finer scale data to this coarser level, you're going to end up with maybe cells that ideally wouldn't be included in the model. But yeah, given that I was not really involved in the actual acquisition of this data, I don't know how much more I can speak to that question. I'm sorry.
That was a great answer though, Andrew. To flesh that a little bit more, so we've been working my former grad student and I, we've been working with the city of Richmond for about a year and a half or so to really identify what data sources they had available and how they wanted us to imagine the analysis criteria. So this is not something that we're just kind of like doing in a vacuum. Like, I guess in theory, I could do this myself, not talk to anybody, publish it in a scholarly journal, and like 4 people would ever read it. I guess that would probably keep my job, but that's not actually really changing anything. So by having a dynamically engaged process with the government, and then also in theory, hopefully with the farmers and other stakeholders, that's an important part of this process. And so, but at the same time, yeah, we are a slave to what data is available. And as the web app is really exciting because as we're moving towards cities starting to have that being dynamically updated on servers, then we can just be pulling that, as the data gets refreshed, we can just be pulling that to update our maps, which I think is incredibly exciting because, I don't know, 10-ish years ago when I did most of my GIS education, everything was still static. This was right before AGOL came online and everything was static. And so I thought we're just going to be constantly updating the stuff all the time to keep it fresh. And then Andrew and Emily, my former grad student, really blew my mind. They're like, oh no, all this can be dynamically linked now. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, great. That's amazing. Martin, to your question, the medians and highways. So in Europe, there are like Denmark and other Swedish countries, they do some urban agriculture within highway medians. And Andrew and I, we just started kind of thinking about that. Andrew, I don't know if you can easily pull up the loose space analysis. You probably can't in the few minutes we have left here.
Yeah,
but we were starting to try to figure out, are there like easements around transportation corridors, other loose spaces is the term of spaces that would otherwise be not thought of as usable in any way. Think like maybe under power lines, for instance, or the median space of a highway that potentially a median space in a highway probably would be kind of bad because like how do you physically get people in and out of the space? But that's something we have thought about. And so we're just starting to have some analysis based on, informed by the model here to try to identify what those spaces could be. And so, Martin, I'm really glad you brought that up. We are definitely trying to think about that. I don't have anything really cool to show you yet, but we're definitely moving in the direction of that because, think of there's like a little sliver of land next to a road, a major road maybe, that can't really be used for anything else, but it's within an easement. And so it functionally will not be used for anything else, and it legally can't be used for anything else, but it might be able to be used for this sort of purpose. How do we identify that through the analysis model? So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up.
If I could interject just for a second, because it actually
please.
has to do with this like loose space situation. And I'm sorry if your name is Debbie and not to be a Debbie Downer, but so when I'm thinking about highway medians, and first of all, like I am no pro when it comes to urban agriculture, nope. So, but when I think about, okay, these loose spaces on corridors or vacant land, all I'm thinking about is really dirty soil. And it's the place, either it's like brownfield, it's film material, it's runoff, a lot of runoff. I'm thinking, it just gross soil.
Yeah.
Can you respond to that?
Yeah.
And how,
yeah.
Because the first thing that I think of is absolutely not. I am not eating a vegetable that's coming off of a highway.
So there's some research out of Virginia Tech that says that some of the fears around some types of soil contamination are not as serious as some people may initially think that they are. Obviously, we still need to be avoiding things like heavy metals, and we should be doing testing for that before you start doing anything at producing anything at a site. But this is something Andrew and I have been talking about recently also, if we remove the soil suitability from the analysis, but we kept everything else, and we said, okay, if soil's not a thing that we're worried about, but this is still a really high scoring site, think about if there was a municipal composting operation that could start amending the soil, because really the problem you're talking about is how do we get a good soil profile there? If there was a municipal composting operation, and the city of Richmond has one, we could start bringing healthy soil to that site to start producing really high scoring, really highly suitable, healthy soil at that site. And then as you're building additional infrastructure, that's also going to help out as well. And so your concern is exceptionally valid if you're thinking about it in an incredibly short-term capacity. If you're thinking about it in a little bit of a longer term, I think that is a conquerable problem, even if there is potential, like not necessarily the healthiest soil there. That's not, but like in the span of like, can we grow something today? Maybe not. But could we do some site engineering and improve it so that maybe 2 years from now or 5 years from now, we could be growing a lot there? Yes, I think that's also possible. But it's like,
which also, to your point about transient, like not looking at it like temporary gardening, but long-term.
Yeah, and I think we need transitive gardening and we need transformational gardening. We need both of those things. There's value in both of those.
Okay.
So I'm happy to keep answering questions. I realize we're probably technically out of time here, but Christine, that's a wonderful question. I'm really glad you answered that. I'm really glad you asked it. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Well, we are gonna go ahead and wrap up because I promised we'd only be on here for an hour. So we gotta, I guess I would say, if folks have questions, feel free to email either me at info@ohioplanning.org, or if you have Susan's contact info, email her,
I put
or
my email in
you
the
could
chat
just
there, but
email
obviously we
John
can,
directly.
we
Which I
can
guess
follow up as well.
we'd prefer.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us. This was wonderful. Susan, do you have any other final closing remarks?
Just, yes, please come to Dayton and do this analysis. I think this is would be amazing. So thank you so much for your time, for being our guinea pig with our section to do this format, and looking forward to seeing where your research and work goes into the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, I'll talk. Let's talk. I love Carl. Carl knows about this, and as we've talked about off and on for a long time. So yeah, we'll talk.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Have a great day. Be well. Bye.
Bye.